Okay, just to repeat it one more time, I'm a big believer in repetition as a pedagogical tool. Grant's going to go after Lee. Sherman's going to go after Joe Johnson. Um, that's in terms of if you're looking at the map, Grant's going after Richmond, and it looks like Sherman's going after Atlanta. But don't get fooled by that. Really, Grant and Sherman are going after the armies. They're not going after. They're not capturing positions now. What they want to do is they want to grind down. They want to grind down the Confederate Army in both Georgia and Virginia. So this campaign, Grant's campaign in the East, and Sherman's campaign in Georgia start in the spring of 1864. Now, I'm going to have you watch a podcast, not a podcast, a really fantastic History Channel documentary on Sherman's March. Sherman's March is a very iconic march. Um, Even to this day, you've got tried and true Southerners talking about Sherman's March happens in two parts. Okay, the first part is where Sherman goes to Atlanta, and it takes him a while to get there. It takes him almost the whole summer to get there. And by the way, when Sherman takes Atlanta, which is in I think September of 1864, this guarantees Lincoln's reelection. Before Sherman took Atlanta, Grant's struggling in Virginia, and Sherman looks like he's not making much movement, forward progress either. Lincoln himself thought he was going to lose the 1864 election. But after Sherman takes Atlanta in September of 64, Lincoln's reelection is a done deal. It's a huge psychological boost as well as a military boost. So in that sense, Atlanta is an important objective. But ultimately, what Grant and Sherman are doing are going after the armies. Okay, so it comes in two parts. The less famous part for non-Civil War folks is the part where Sherman takes Atlanta, the campaign to take Atlanta. The much more famous part is when Sherman, after he captures Atlanta, he decides to march to Savannah, to the Atlantic Ocean. He cuts himself off from communication lines. He cuts himself off from supply lines, and this is the famous Sherman's March that you'll see the documentary on today. It's his march from Atlanta to Savannah, which takes him a couple of months, and nobody knows where he is because he's completely cut himself off from the supply lines. What Sherman does is he takes a page from Grant's book in Mississippi during the Vicksburg campaign, and basically Sherman is living off the land. But here's an important point, and it's one of the big things I want you to take from the course. Sherman's march to the sea, from Atlanta to Savannah, you would have not have wanted to have been in the way of it if you were white or African American, because sadly a number of African American women were sexually assaulted during the march to the sea. So it's no picnic for anybody. And in fact, in some ways, it was worse for African Americans who were, on one hand, getting liberated, but they were dealing with an army that Sherman had pretty good discipline of, but on the edges there was real violence against freed slaves and especially slave women. Okay, now to talk about the whites though, and it's the whites who feel aggrieved about Sherman's march to this very day. And what the documentary I think will show, and Grimsley, remember Conciliatory War to Hard War, he talks about this. Sherman was not nearly as destructive in moving from Atlanta to Savannah as legend would have it. As you'll see when you watch the documentary, Sherman, when he goes and he would burn kind of a farmhouse. He would burn some plantations, but he doesn't leave as nearly as much destruction as legend would have it. And the reason that we know this is the 1860 census. Sherman actually had the 1860 census in hand, and he made up for his soldiers very, very detailed maps of the plantations that they would face between Atlanta and Savannah, which is kind of really interesting to think about. Anyway, so they know what's there. They know what they're facing. They're facing kind of a weak army, but they know what they're facing in terms of civilians. But in the late 1950s, about 100 years after Sherman's march, a historian redid Sherman's march based on the 1860 census. And what he found was most of the plantation houses that existed in 1860 still existed in 1960, probably 75%. I can't remember the exact figure now, but it was well over a majority. So the point here is that what Sherman does on Sherman's march, he destroys property, especially kind of, you'll see outhouses. There is theft. The Union soldiers go in, steal silver. They do all kinds of really nasty stuff. But you do not have a massacre of Southern whites on Sherman's march. It just does not happen. And what Grimsley talks about is that what Sherman does is he focuses on the destruction of property versus the killing of people. And Grimsley talks about, he compares Sherman's march to the war against Indians, the Plains Wars, both before and after the Civil War. In the wars against various native peoples, especially after the Civil War, it was pretty genocidal. You had men, women, and children killed by the U.S. Army. You don't have that in Georgia. You don't have a genocidal attack on Southern whites. You do not have mass executions. So for the most part, it's violence against property instead of violence against people. And that's a key distinction that's really been lost to history, and that's been lost in the myth of Sherman's march. And hopefully one of the things you're taking from this course, I haven't talked about it that much. There's so much encrusted myth about the Civil War. It's really hard to get to the truth. But so I want you to watch this documentary. I know it runs a bit long for this week, in addition to this podcast, but you know what? I promise I'll make it up to you at some point. And I think the documentary is really, really outstanding. So, and it does a good job of talking about the overall strategic situation and Grant and Sherman's partnership. So it's a really an outstanding documentary. So please watch it. Watch the whole thing. You'll be quizzed on it. And the big points, the big take-home points, Grant, his overall strategy, a coordinated movement of all Union armies against the entire Confederate line at the same time. Something that had not happened before, to put the maximum pressure on the Confederate armies instead of these hodgepodge offensives in the east and in the west where there's no coordination at all. Okay, that's number one. That's Grant's overall scheme for winning the Civil War, and ultimately that is what defeats the South, although it's very, very, very bloody. In the first month of his campaign, which I haven't talked about, but I will next week, Grant, 6 weeks or so, Grant loses like 60,000 men killed and wounded in Virginia. Just incredible, just horrific. So there's that. Grant's overall plan, and one of the ways you might want to think about it, Grant goes after Lee, Sherman goes after Joe Johnson. Okay, that's just the bullet point. And then the second thing, and I want you to watch for, and we'll talk about it in class along with the document I'm posting, is Grant's strategy Sherman's strategy as he moves towards Savannah. This idea of violence against property versus violence against people. That Sherman's march, although you would have not wanted to have been in the way of Sherman's march, if you were either a Southern white or African American, is not nearly as violent and destructive as historical myth would have us believe.